Hi, everyone. We're just waiting for people to get into the webinar. So we'll just give it about another minute before we kick off our webinar. What's the deal with the ACT and SAT? We're excited to have you with us tonight. So we'll just, again, give it about another minute, and then I will introduce my lovely guest.
And then we'll get to talk about the most exciting topic ever.
It is truly, truly the most exciting topic.
I'm at the end of my iced coffee, so I'm fueled up.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Tonight we have a great Q&A, a fun conversation that we'll have about testing, about test prep, everything ACT and SAT. And I'm Christina Dooley. I'm the founder of Estrella Consulting. I'm happy to be with everyone tonight. And my guest today is Josefine Borrmann, who's the founder of Strive to Learn. And Josephine and I have been friends for quite a bit of time. We both love the education space, and we love sharing our knowledge with anyone that we can. And so we thought, let's do a webinar together and tag team on this topic of ACT and SAT testing. So Josephine, thank you for joining me tonight. I'm super excited to have you here on the webinar. So why don't we, what I thought maybe what we could do is maybe you could just tell a little bit about Strive to Learn before we get started.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'm the founder of Strive to Learn. We do tutoring, test prep, and college admissions consulting. So we really try to be a one-stop for all, to really help our students with, any learning struggles they might have, then to deal with that beast that we are going to talk about today, which is standardized testing, and then also figuring out how do both of those things come together to actually work on a college application or other future, career opportunities. And the reason why I started Strive to Learn is because I was working as a tutor and in very dark and dingy tutoring centers. And I was just like, man, I don't want to be here, and I'm getting paid to be here. My poor students, but no sunlight. And we're in California, like the beach is not very far away. And these kids didn't even see the beach or the light of day for a long time during the summer. So I decided to start my own company that's very much based on modeling a growth mindset, really finding joy in learning, and figuring out, that school it doesn't have to suck if you don't like a subject.
Yep.
I learned that because I really hated math, and here I am tutoring math.
Who knew? Who knew?
I know. So yeah, really that idea of that growth mindset and helping students find the confidence even when they're confronted with big challenges, especially academically, is really at the core of everything that we do. And that's why standardized tests are weirdly fun, because they are a huge barrier for a lot of students. They can also be an opportunity. We'll talk about that today, but just really helping students figure out, how can I really deal with this beast, and how can I let it not break me, but actually learn something that will aid me in the future, instead of getting super intimidated by this.
Well, and I think you hit so many things right there, just in terms of the anxiety that the testing process it gives to students. And that's, I think, where we can come into play, is lessening a lot of that anxiety. I know at Estrella, it's the same, that we, that's one of the things we really hope to do, is calm fears about what things are and are not. So in the landscape of COVID, I think there's a lot of things that have happened that revolve around testing. So I want to, and my dog's going to chime in on testing too. He does not like it. Trust me, no testing for the dog.
I hear the anxiety in his voice.
He's filled with it. But what I would love is to hear from you about some of the major changes that have happened during COVID when it comes to testing.
Absolutely. I mean, during COVID, a lot has changed, basically. A lot of students were unable to test throughout the last year, which especially affected the students who just graduated as seniors, but it also really affected the students who are now rising seniors, so the graduating class of 2022. So a lot of students haven't been able to sit down and take these tests. In California, 80% of students weren't able to test, I believe, in the past year. It was one of the highest numbers in the nation. Other states, more students could test, but it's been a real big struggle. And this isn't because the test makers decided not to administer it. It's simply because due to COVID school closures, a lot of the test centers were simply not open, and it wasn't safe for students to sit together in a room, breathe in the same air for 3 to 4 hours, and endanger their own safety and others just to take this test. So one of the really big things that has changed is that a lot of colleges, pretty much all colleges, for the students who just graduated, who are going to start this fall in college, decided to go test optional, and some decided to go test free or test blind. Now, a lot of people think test optional is something new, but it's been around since at least the 80s, I believe, and more than 50% of colleges were actually already test optional before COVID ever appeared on the horizon. It just wasn't as well known. It was a lot more the private colleges, the smaller colleges. And so now COVID has really brought this idea of test optional to the forefront and to the common public vernacular, and everyone's hearing about it and thinking, wow, this is a whole new thing. So it's not new, but it's much more widespread now. So this has been a great opportunity, and I definitely want to go more into that. But I also don't want to go off on too big of a tangent. So as far as changes go, let's talk a little bit more about that. The ACT, for example, was going to start doing last September, they were going to have their first round of testing by section. So you take a full length ACT, and then the section you don't like your score in, you could retest that section only. That didn't happen because of COVID. There were such limited test dates and seats that they said, let's scrap that idea for now. Let's put it completely on ice. And instead, we're just going to keep going the way we are. So that's something that also they have confirmed will not be happening in the year 2021, 2022. It might be on the horizon in about 2 years or so. Another thing that changed for the ACT is that now they do report a super score if you have taken the test at least twice. Now, when you get a fee waiver, you can get the fee waivers automatically for at least 2 test sittings. So that's really nice for students who, maybe thought they can't afford to test multiple times or get that super score. But on the other hand, the super score that is shown on the ACT score report, I feel like it's a little bit more for the students' peace of mind, for the students to really understand how would a university view their scores across different sittings. A super score means you take the highest score off of the 4 different sections on different days they took them, and you recombine them and average them out to your new super score. So a super score can be higher than either sitting. When the super score gets sent by the ACT, they do still send your composite scores as well that are associated with that super score. So the information the university receives isn't really different, but it provides a great opportunity for students who don't really know that super scoring is a thing at the university, because it's not something that all universities do. You really have to check with each university, do you do that? So before that, I think it was really confusing for students, and a lot of students may have missed an opportunity by only sending their highest score report and not understanding that they could have also sent one of their lower ones in at the same time because the university would super score. This way, we're avoiding that error because students already see, oh, I should send my super score because it's higher in this university super scores. So it just creates a little more transparency around the process, I think. So those are the big changes on the ACT site. So, one change was that the change didn't happen. And then the other change was just a little more transparency on the score reporting from the student side. Big changes happened with the College Board. This January, they announced that the optional essay on the SAT test will be completely scrapped, and it was scrapped as of the day of the announcement in January. So students who had signed up for the optional essay were refunded their extra $20 and took their test without it. So it's truly a multiple choice test now. The math section has some open answer questions, but there are no true, sentence formed open answer questions, no essay questions at all on the SAT anymore. Now the ACT still has its optional essay, but when one big test changes something big like that, the other one usually follows suit. So we're still waiting to hear and see what the ACT is going to announce about that. As of now, they haven't announced anything. But because the SAT no longer has the optional essay, no colleges can actually require you to take it with the optional essay. right? Because colleges don't care which of the two tests you take. That's a common myth that a college on the East Coast might prefer one test and a college, no. You can ask any college admissions representative and they always say, take the one that really goes towards your strengths. So they can't say that and tell you to take an essay, because what if the SAT has your strengths, but it has no essay, right? So basically, you don't really need to take the essay on the ACT. It's optional, and now it's truly optional. Before that, it was, you should still try and take it. But now that the SAT doesn't have it anymore, you really can just kind of omit that. The other big change on the SAT was that the College Board got rid of all the SAT subject tests and told students to focus more on AP testing, because a lot of AP tests were the same subject matter as the subject tests, just asked a little differently. And so that was another big one that they made effective as of January for international students as of June of this year. So also for international students, it's now in effect, but for, US schools or students, it has been in effect since January. So did I get it all? Did I get all?
You got a lot of things, yeah. But so even with, I think the good news is for those folks listening with underclassmen is that even though there's been that obviously COVID and the pandemic have changed a lot of things, made it challenging for test sittings and all of that. There've been a couple of silver linings that have come from it, which are the elimination of the subject test and the elimination of the writing section, which I think both of those had their time coming anyway. So I think that was, a good thing. And what a lot of people didn't realize was that even students who were not taking the writing section of those tests were still sitting for the experimental sections. They still had to stay, so it wasn't like their test time was any less. It was just that they were basically doing an experimental section to see if questions worked for future tests. So I think that's really good. So I think what I'd love to do, first I want to just mention, if anybody's listening and has questions along the way, you can utilize the Q&A. Feel free to pop any questions into the Q&A that you have for either Josephine or myself about the testing landscape or changes to expect or see. But in the meantime, maybe what I'd like to do, Josephine, is could you talk with us a little bit about how do you choose which one of these you take? I know that's a question that I get from parents all the time and students is, okay, they're two different tests. How do I know which one is better for me? And you just busted the myth about, the preference from colleges, which is something we also always tell our families is, they're different. Colleges will accept either one of them, but let's start at the beginning. How do you know? How do you know which one you should take?
Well, step one is you got to take them so that you know what you're scoring. Get a good baseline score. So we tell all of our students to please take a diagnostic full-length test of each. So we offer these on our website. They're downloadable off of our website, but we also offer proctored online sittings Saturdays at 8 a.m. Yay! That's when the real test happens, and taking a practice test in a setting that is as close to the real test as possible, so also at a time when you may not want to be testing, is going to give you the most accurate prediction of your score. There are a lot of websites out there that say, hey, take this 10-minute quiz and we'll tell you which test you should study for. I highly encourage you to not do that. We've had students come in, saying, I know it's the SAT, like I've done my research, and we just couldn't convince them to take a full diagnostic test of each. And after taking the SAT twice and doing a bunch of tutoring, test prep, they're like, you know what, actually, I would like to try the ACT. And I'm just like, oh, you could have saved yourself so much time if you had opened yourself up to just taking, that additional diagnostic test. So the tests that we use are real tests that have been used and administered in the past by the College Board or the ACT. And it's just really important. Timing is a huge factor. Fatigue is a huge factor. These things are different on those tests. The way that the sections are organized is different. Right? The ACT has the math section as its second section, and the SAT, the second half is math. So when do you want your math, and what's going to fatigue you more? How is that going to affect you on the subsequent sections, right? You won't know that if you don't take a full-length diagnostic test. So that's the first thing I suggest. Now, the ACT is scored out of 36. The 4 sections are average. The SAT is scored out of 1,600. how do you compare those? How do you know which test is better, right? Which one is showing your strengths more, and not letting your weaknesses come out as much? That's really the question. So the ACT on their website, as well as the College Board, they both have concordance tables. I highly recommend downloading those and taking a look at, which score is where. That's something that we offer for free. We actually sit down with anyone who wants to and go over their diagnostic tests. So we have like a really nice score report that breaks down every single item, far more than the real score reports do, so that the student, after really going through that with our academic coordinator, would really understand, okay, here's what I need to work on. Now I can take this to my Khan Academy, my free portal on Khan Academy, and I can really prepare for it if it's the SAT that you're preparing for. Because we do encourage everyone, use the resources that are available to you. Test prep is great. I mean, I obviously believe in it. I started a test prep company. It's wonderful to have a personalized mentor, but that's not accessible to everyone. And some students are really independent, and there are a lot of free opportunities out there. And that's one of the reasons why we do, the free evaluation with a real human on Zoom, just like this, who can really help you understand which score is better. Okay, so that was just kind of how to get started. But if you're on your own and you're really trying to figure out who am I and what are these tests about, here's some key differences between the tests. I'll start with a myth. A lot of students say, oh, I think I will be better at the ACT because I'm good at math and science. Okay, great. So why do you think the ACT is better for that? Oh, because it has a math section and a science section, and the SAT only has a math section. So here's a myth. On the SAT, 50% of your scores actually, well, here's the truth, I would say. On the SAT, 50% of your score comes from math. Half of your score is math. On the ACT, we have 4 sections. One of those sections, the second section, is math, and the last section is science. Each one of those is a fourth of your score, 25% of your score. So if you're very strong in math, then the SAT might serve you better because 50% of your score comes from math. The other thing is that the science section usually surprises students. The science section on the ACT is really more like a how well can you read a paragraph or an experiment and interpret the data in a pie chart or table and answer some questions. It definitely doesn't necessitate any preconceived knowledge beyond water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, that kind of like very basic scientific knowledge. There are about 5 facts, I think, that students need to know. That is one of them. Other than that, you don't need to, study your entire bio, physics, and chemistry curriculum because it is very much like an open book test, just asking you about what you read, that, maybe an experiment that was described, a theory that was described, something like that. So students are very surprised that it feels much more like a reading section. So a student who really struggles with reading comprehension, quick critical reading when you don't have a lot of time, that student might do better on the SAT because the SAT gives you more time per question. So that's a huge difference. The SAT is a slower pace. The ACT is a faster pace. So oftentimes our students, once they take their diagnostic tests and compare them, they're really surprised. And they're not surprised by their score. They're surprised after they took them because they're like, wow, the one I thought would be harder was actually easier. And then their score usually reflects how they felt. And I think, that's really important. For example, some students score pretty similarly on the 2. So I always ask them, which one didn't stress you out as much? Which one did you feel more, okay, I'm doing my thing and it's not that bad while you were taking it, because then you should focus on that one if your scores are pretty equivalent. So it really depends on a lot of different things. I think timing is a big one, and really, really understanding how stressed out do you get when you see that clock ticking. And then really feeling out the math sections is important. The SAT has more logical reasoning questions. The ACT math feels a little bit more like school, a little more familiar in that way, the way that the questions are phrased. So again, we can't just say I'm good or bad at math. One works better than the other, right? I think the other thing to remember is that neither one of these tests has any calculus on it, really no pre-calculus. The majority is pre-algebra, algebra, and geometry, and then some algebra 2 trig. So if you haven't yet taken algebra 2 trig, then you'll be fine. there are not that many questions on there that you won't be able to answer. So I think that's another important one to think about. Like in overall, we can all de-stress a little bit about the math, because it's really about the math that you've been doing for the last 3 years rather than the math that you haven't done yet, right?
Right.
So that one's important too.
And I think that's actually a really good point, Josephine, because I think oftentimes I'll have families where the student will say, you know what, I'm going to wait until summer after my junior year or spring of my junior year to take it so I have more math under my belt. And I say, when did you take Algebra 1? And they say 9th grade. And I say, well, here's what you really should do, because to your point, sometimes the further they're removed from that really basic algebra, it can be, even if they're in AP Calc, it can be challenging because they've forgotten some of that basic stuff. So I think, if right now, if you're a parent or a student and you're listening or watching this and you're thinking, when should I be taking it? I'm not advocating for students to be taking it in middle school, but certainly sophomores, I think, are okay to take it. I think if you wait too long, and this is not to scare families, but I've said to some of my students, take it when you have an opportunity to take it, because hopefully nothing like COVID gets in the way again. But there are other things that get in the way from testing. And I know one of the piece of advice that we give our students all the time is to take a look at your schedule during a typical year and say, what are you involved in? Are you a fall athlete? Are you on the football team or the marching band, which we know historically have Friday night games? And Saturday morning, taking an ACT or SAT is not going to be, you're not going to be your peak performance for that test if you are in season during that time. And same thing, I know I have sometimes swimmers who they're getting ready to have a swim meet on a Saturday afternoon, and they think, oh, I have to sit for my ACT in the morning. Well, that's not fun. There are lots of other opportunities to take it. I forget exactly the right number right now because they've added ACT and SAT test dates. That's another silver lining, I guess, is they've added some additional dates, including summer dates. And so I think the message is that you have ample opportunities to take it if you start early enough that you can plan ahead. Would you agree with all that?
Absolutely. Actually, the timeline that we propose the most to mitigate stress, because I think that's right, coming back to kind of how our conversation started, is that all of this can be very anxiety provoking. And there are a lot of mental health struggles. And now with COVID having exacerbated those for a lot of teens. So we have always built our recommendation of the test taking timeline around really what is the least stressful for the student. So doing it in freshman year, no, that's kind of stressful. You're only a freshman. Don't do it unless you really want to and or you're really excited about it. But no, we really recommend using the summer between sophomore year and junior year to get started. So our ideal timeline for all the students that have come through our virtual doors that got done with it, felt good about their score, and also felt like they didn't stress too hard, was that once school got out in sophomore year, they took a week or two, get a little bit of a break, and then they did the 2 diagnostic tests. So an ACT, maybe one Saturday, wait a week, do the SAT the next Saturday. Don't stack them on the same day. Your second test is going to suck. And then they did an evaluation, figured out where am I at? What's my goal score, right? And that's something that's heavily dependent on what colleges you might want to apply to. And just thinking about what score increase would I want, do I want to come up like 50 points, 100 points, 150 points? What's my goal here? And then figuring out, okay, so then maybe I'll take my first one in September, or maybe I want a little more time. Maybe I'll take my first one in October. I love the September test date just because it's right when school starts. So you're not yet fully overwhelmed by your schoolwork. But they only have only the ACTs in September. So if you want to take your SAT first and you still want ample time to prepare, you might want to do the October test. It's October. It's the first Saturday in October. So usually October 2nd through 5th. So really school hasn't gotten too crazy by then yet. Right. So it's usually a good time. And then really studying consistently for 8 to 10 weeks leading up to that test date, doing more full-length practice tests in addition to, of course, doing mini lectures and really learning about the concepts that your first score report showed you need a little refresher on. Taking that first test September, October looking at the scores, comparing them to your diagnostic, really understanding, okay, am I happy with this? Does this feel good? Do I feel like I could do better? And then deciding at that point if you're going to take it a second time and when. Most of our students do take it a second time. I think on average across the nation, students take it 2 to 3 times. And that may sound like a lot, but it's actually kind of a relaxing notion, because your first test, you prepare for it well, you do your best, but it's your first test. It is not a make it or break it moment. It is not a be all and end all. So it allows students to score higher because they're not pressuring themselves so much. Then the second test, we usually recommend taking it before winter break in junior year, so that everything you learned is still fresh. So most of our students end up taking the December test, as long as it's not conflicting with their finals. So this is very important, Christina, what you said. Make sure that you know your schedule. If you're an athlete, if you're in the marching band, if you're in a theater play and that's your tech week, don't do it then. If you have finals, don't do it then. So every student needs to figure out their own timeline so that they can really have the peace of mind to tackle the test. And so most of our students, they're done and have the score they want before Christmas of junior year. And the reason that is so de-stressing for them is because then, in junior year, everyone's like, so where are you going to go to college? What major do you want? All these questions start flying at you and you're like, oh my God. So students start stressing themselves out. They also have the hardest workload that they've ever had. They might have their first APs. Students who had an AP in sophomore year might suddenly have 3 or 4 APs if they're really going for it, right? So it's not going to get easier. The workload is not going to get lighter in the second half of junior year. You might have your AP test, you have all this stuff going on, and you're starting to think about colleges. You're wanting to do some college visits. Hopefully you're working with a company like Estrella or Direct to Learn to really build that college list and explore those careers and opportunities and think about your extracurriculars. So that all becomes so much more exciting when this test isn't also like hanging over you like this dark cloud while you're also worrying about your finals and your APs, right?
Yeah, and that's I'd say that is a really great point about the spring testing, because I know especially this year, a lot of kids, because there was a lack of opportunity with test dates getting canceled during the course of the year, they were scrambling to try to get one in, and we're testing in the spring, simultaneously getting ready for APs and finals and all those things. That's a really tough time. And I agree with you. My favorite time for kids to test is those beginning of the school year tests, because they're not into the throes of their schoolwork yet. And so it is nice to have it. I like the timeline you proposed. Thank you for sharing kind of like the timeline in terms of prep and giving an 8 to 10 week window. I think some people feel like when they're starting to prepare for these, that it has to be like a year to 2 endeavor where we're going to be doing test prep every day for whatever. But I think there's value in spreading out and not cramming at the end. I also think, and I'd love to hear your take on this, is when students take that first actual test and they get their scores back, I feel like it gives them an opportunity for the subsequent test to look at, how did I do? Where are my opportunities for score increases? And I think, from what I know in terms of the way the scoring works, for example, on the ACT, even just 1 or 2 additional questions correct on the math section can change your composite. I mean, it can really impact it. So I think if they're, looking where those opportunities are, and that's where someone, like you and your tutors who are experts in the testing piece of it, would be able to look at the test scores and say, here's where we can focus. Some students might do well focusing on everything, continuing just prep on all subject areas. But I do think there's probably some students where it is beneficial maybe to just focus on 1 or 2 areas.
I think you make a really good point. I mean, I think that's actually one of the big reasons why I got into test prep, is because when you're alone studying for these tests, you kind of blanket learning, right? You're just trying to get better at it. But if you don't know the test inside and out, as well as someone who looks at it every day and who's analyzed hundreds of tests, then you don't know, what should I really be spending my time on? So you made a really good point that even answering 2 more questions right could push your composite score up an entire point, or at least half, yeah, an entire point. Because on the ACT, it's average, right? So you may be scoring a 23.25.
Mhm.
That means you have a 23.
Mhm.
If that comes up to a 23.5, which means coming up 1 point on one section, it flips to a 24, right? Because you round up. So that one math question could get you that score increase. So it's really important to understand which areas am I missing a lot of questions in, where if I learned these 3 skills, I would suddenly get these 5 questions right, because I'm just a little weak on triangles right now. So
Mhm.
if I really focus on my triangles and my theorems and really solidifying that knowledge and doing word problems that are actually about triangles, even though they might look like algebra, right? Because no one drew it for me. And really honing in on that skill, then that is time spent very wisely on studying that can have a very significant impact on your overall score versus, you know, seeing, oh, I got 2 trig questions wrong. There are only 4 trig questions on the entire 6 out of the 60 math questions on the ACT. You know, 2 of them are SOHCAHTOA and the other 2 are high level trig. Don't even worry about them. You can get a 35 on the ACT and still miss those 2 on the math section. 35 is almost perfect, right? 36 would be perfect. So just know that too, like this is really important. And that's why our score reports are so detailed. They literally say like triangles, and then they break it down into several different ones so that you can really, as a student, understand, oh, okay, this is manageable now. So breaking these big, scary tests down into the small chunks and just focusing on those. Like one of the things that really bumps up our student scores is that when we first start the test prep for the writing section, or it's called writing and language on the SAT, it's called the English section on the ACT. It's really the same thing, just the timing is different, but the way the questions are structured is actually exactly the same. So it's that's the section that's most similar between the 2 tests. One of the big things we do with every single student, even our very high scoring students on that section, is we take at least 2 sessions to really go over punctuation, to learn what is a semicolon versus a comma versus a colon versus a period, etc. When do I use all of these? What makes them right or wrong? Because those are really, they're like, this is right, this is wrong, and nobody knows why, but we do, and we tell our students, and suddenly their score on that section jumps up. And why do we do that? Because grammar and usage is a really big part of that score. There's also other parts of that score, rhetorical skills, etc. But those are a little more qualitative in nature. They take a little longer to hone in on. So really working with someone who can tell you, okay, this thing that seems like kind of a scary thing, like commas and semicolons, right? It can be pretty scary when you don't understand them. Let's break it down. This is really all that you need to know about them to answer every single colon and semicolon question on this test. And suddenly students are like, wow, I wish I had known this. Cool. And their scores jumps up. I mean, 5 points, after just a few sessions on that section, because they now have this knowledge that they had never been taught in that way. And I think, you asked me in the beginning about Strive to Learn, and I think a really big part of why I created it too is that I'm by nature a little bit lazy. I like to study smart. And I just really, really love helping students understand how can I spend less time doing busy work and really focus time on what I do need to know, so that then I can build that confidence, but also have a life and find balance, right? Balance is really important. And so really learning how to study smart for these tests and what to focus on for you specifically, which is very different from your friend over here or your neighbor over there, right? I think that's so valuable and so important, to take the stress factor out and to make the test prep, whether you're doing it on your own or with a tutor, to really make it feel like a growth opportunity and like somewhere where you're moving forward instead of running against a wall over and over again.
Yeah, and I think that some of the things like what you're talking about, teaching content and teaching the right way of doing things, I mean, ultimately, that knowledge is going to help these students in the future anyway, when they're going on to college. I mean, and the grammar stuff, to your point, I mean, it's something that at least, and I read a lot of college essays, so I can say this, it's gone by the wayside. So, so thank you for spending the time doing that, Josephine. I appreciate it. But I also think one other like kind of pro tip that I would say for families listening and for students listening is when you take the ACT or SAT, when you register, you'll get the opportunity to request your, like on the ACT, you can request your actual results with the questions that were asked and what you got right or wrong. That's incredibly helpful versus just getting your score, because when you see the questions you got wrong, you can then take them back, either if you're doing prep on your own, and just trying to go through, or if you're working with a tutor, take that to them so they can see, okay, well, these are the things that you're missing. So there is an extra cost to that, I should say that, but I will say the families that I have who do that have found it to be a great use of those funds, because it then helps direct where you're spending your time with prep or studying beyond that.
Yeah, I always say $20 well spent. Think about what else you're spending money on. And I think it's $20, and you can't always do it. Not all of the test dates allow it, but when you can, when that is an option for you to select, do it. You'll get the entire test booklet sent to you. It's amazing. So you can look at the exact test that you took and work through it and really understand, like, why did I get this question wrong, and dig deep. And I think that's really important, digging deep and so when I say take a test, a practice test, I don't mean take it and then forget about it. Mm-hmm. Take it, score it, engage with all the ones that you missed. Also, while you're taking them, mark the ones that you're unsure about, where you kind of guessed, or maybe you were caught, you knew A and D are definitely not the answer, but you're caught between B and C, and then you made an informed guess. Mark them as you're taking your practice test, so that later, if you get that one right, you don't just forget it ever happened. You go back and you look at it. Okay, this is what I was confused on, but I did get it right. So what worked for me here? Like, what was I doing correctly on my educated guess that I really want to internalize, that I'm going to continue doing that the next time I take a test? So reinforcing your positive habits, as well as nipping your negative habits in the bud, and really figuring out, okay, was this one a knowledge or a process issue? Am I not understanding the question? Like, am I missing a little detail and I totally could have done it? So many times students read a question and they're like, oh, it's A, not B. And then it's important to not just say, oh, I do know it, and move on, but instead to stop and really ask yourself, but why didn't I get it right when I looked at it the first time? What did I miss? And what strategies can I really develop for myself to catch myself in the moment so that I don't miss that the next time a similar question comes around? A lot of students lose points on something easy like that. So that's why I always say it's about process and knowledge. Knowledge is like, okay, I just didn't know. Like, I knew I had to get the area of a triangle, and like, I forgot how to, and I forgot that they give you the formula, right? They do give you formulas, so don't forget about that sheet. Versus, oh, I didn't know that they wanted the area of a triangle, but now I'm seeing that's what they want. Well, then why did I miss that, right? So process and knowledge really come together. Knowledge is, sometimes easier to acquire on your own, because there's great YouTube videos or great test prep books, etc. Process is something that sometimes our students just come in for a couple sessions, or they're like, okay, I feel like I know everything, but my score is just really stuck. And most of the time, it's just like, how are you engaging with the question, and what strategies are you using in that moment to narrow down your answer choices and make sure to chunk it out so that your brain isn't trying to do 100 things at once, right? So really recommend, like you said, Christina, with the real test, trying to go back and figure out exactly what happened, but even more so with practice tests. So it's actually really recommended to take the same practice test more than once. So here's my story. I used to suck at the math section of the SAT. I mean, I took it, I studied so hard, and I was in the 50th percentile. I had a 530. And then I studied again, and I studied really, really hard. This was also 2 years later, because I was transferring. And it was just a scholarship opportunity for me to take this test again. It's really, really hard. I got a 640. Now I get 780s, sometimes 800s, sometimes 760s. So I'm in the 99th percentile. While back then I was firmly stuck in the 50s. And why was that the case when I was studying so hard and so much? The way I really got better, me personally, and it works for pretty much all of my students is that I didn't just keep doing different practice problems, but I went back to the same problems that really threw me for a loop over and over again. And I worked through them until I could get the entire section right, because they are not reinventing the test every time. When you do that, you're going to start seeing things come up again and again in similar wording, just with the details flipped out. And so if you start really getting used to those patterns, and start being able to catch yourself when you're about to miss that crucial detail, then you're really building that process skill set. And you're not going to always just memorize and remember the answers, you know? And it's really interesting when you think you really got a question because you saw you got it wrong the first time, you read through the answer explanation, you redid it by hand, and you're like, okay, I get it now. And then a month later, you take that same math section just to see what's going to happen, and you get that question wrong again, then you know, wait, I got to go back to basics. There's something that, even though I got it, I didn't internalize it, right? And so I think that's really important. Rather than trying to plow through 20 practice tests, you know, do 3, but really engage with them and use them as your tool to get better at the things that you can't explain why you're stuck, right? So that's one of my big recommendations at getting better on these tests, for sure. That's how I raised my score from all right to really good.
Well, that's how I get better at my running segment on the Strava app, is I just keep running the same one over and over again until I get the local legend or the PR. And runner people, I'm a very mediocre runner, but I'm trying to get better.
I love this analogy. I use that with my students all the time. Like, you can't expect from just understanding it once to be able to replicate it like a pro. I mean, you know, I have students who like are pitchers for baseball teams. I'm like, how many times did you throw that ball until you pitched like a curveball? Or, okay, I'm really bad at sports analogies, so I hope that was the right sport. But right, and they're like, thousands of times. I'm like, this is the same thing. You are flexing a muscle. You know, I mean, anatomically, it's not a muscle, your brain, but it works the same way, right? Your muscles have memory built in because they work on neurons. That's how they, you know what to do, because you're sending a signal. And the more often you do that in the same way over and over, the more it becomes a reflex. You want to start gaining that kind of reflex to the process of taking this test. And so when you think about it the same way you would think about being involved in athletics or learning to play your musical instrument, like you're doing a lot of scales on the piano, even though scales are not the song, right? So you may have to do like a lot of drills of one type of question, because then when it's mixed in with all the others, you still have that reflex of knowing, aha, this is what I do. So really getting in that mindset and knowing it's a bit of a marathon if you really want to improve your score drastically, right? If you're okay with just a little bit of improvement, you know, that's fine too, but there's a lot that can be done. I mean, we've had students who improved their score like 450 points on the SAT, and it was amazing, you know. Did they do it overnight? No. They retook the test like 4 times and studied for a year. Does everyone need to do that? Absolutely not. It really needs to come from you, and you need to understand what's good for you and where you want to go and why you're even taking this test. I think that's really important too. Yeah. So really finding your path along that test. And again, not even looking at what is everyone else doing, because it doesn't matter. You're a different person, right? You're your own person.
I think that's a really good point. I think let's shift a little bit and spend the last little bit of time we have together. This time is flying, by the way. So I didn't know that test prep could be so interesting and testing could be so interesting. So, but I also, again, if anyone has any specific questions for either Josephine or I, please put them in the Q&A. But one thing that I think a lot of people are wondering about is the impact of testing on the college admission process and what's required and what schools will be using the tests, and how do you know what they're using it for? Do I need it for scholarship consideration? If I'm applying test optional, how do I know if they see my scores or not? What if I send the 4 free score reports from the ACT, but then I decide to apply test optional? So I thought maybe we could go over some of those things. And so what I'll say is, over the past year, I have been on, I cannot even count the number of webinars with deans of admission, directors of admission, and the conversation around testing has been truly like a roller coaster, because schools have, and to your point, just being about test optional is not a new thing. It's just new to mainstream information, I guess. But there are lots of schools that have been test optional for decades or more and know how to review a file for an applicant with the absence of tests. And there are schools now who I think after this year have gotten their feet wet with that and know how to do that. And know if for parents listening, students listening, you'll hear the term holistic review from admission directors. Admission officers will say we review an applicant holistically, which means we look at all the different pieces of the application before we make a decision. But one of the things I've heard over the past year is that there have been things that have been not necessarily brought to light, but have risen to the surface in terms of how do we evaluate essays, for example, because, and this is a really like a very sad data point, is that college admission officers will often say they have anywhere from 3 to 8 minutes to review a file. It just depends on the school and the number of applications. So if you're looking at those schools that are giving it maybe 4 or 5 minutes for a review, and you think about the amount of time that a student puts into their application, it's like tears of like, oh my gosh, I just spent months putting this stuff together, and they're going to look at it really quickly. But it's a lot of it's almost like going in for an audition. You put all your best stuff together, and you get a little bit of time to show them what you got. And so things like the essay, recommendations, obviously are still important, maybe even more important now. But one of the things I wanted to mention was that even though schools are test optional, unless they are test blind, test optional doesn't mean test blind. It doesn't mean that if you're scoring well, you shouldn't send those scores in, because it's very much, I think of it in the same way as I think of like AP scores, where we say, if you have a 4 or 5, send it in, and depending on the school, maybe even a 3. But if you don't score well, you don't have to send the scores into the school. But if you do have a 5 on the AP physics exam, you want them to see that. So if you're scoring a 33 on the ACT, you probably want them to see that, and it'll be a bonus point for you. So I just wanted to bring that up, that how colleges are reviewing testing. Yes, some policies have changed in a lot of schools, which I should say there's already a lot of colleges that have announced they'll be test optional for the class of 2022 and 2023. And Josephine's in California. You want to share what California is doing?
Sure. Big news, the UCs are now test free, which is the new word for pretty much test blind, which means that you can send your scores in 100 times and they will not look at them or factor them in. So that is the University of California system. It starts right now, basically started last year, but now it's like very official. And they will not look at your score even if you send it in. So it is no longer a part of their review process. They used to have the 14 factor review. Now they have the 13 factor review, because the 14th factor of standardized tests has been taken out. And the Cal States haven't made that announcement yet, but for this application season, for the applicants who are applying this fall of 2021, they will also not consider scores, but they don't know yet if they're going to continue that beyond it.
And that's something I think a lot of people don't realize, is that for state institutions in some states, they're bound to the state system decision. It's not necessarily an individual institution making a decision always. And so I know, for example, Florida last year, there was a long period of time. I mean, people were like, come on, Florida state school, be test optional. So a lot of the decisions are not made by one institution, for a lot of colleges, the decision to go test optional might have been an easy one, because maybe it's something their institution had been toying with for a long time, and this was the push that they needed. And so I think of some of the private colleges. I'm in Ohio, schools like Denison University that have been test optional for a long time, talking with their admission folks, and they say, yeah, I mean, it didn't make sense for us, and so we decided it wasn't a factor that we needed. If students wanted to send scores, they could. So they were actually, my guess is, giving advice to some of those institutions who were going test optional for the first time. And I will just put just an information point in. if you're listening and you're thinking, how do I even know if a school is test optional? The best resource is fairtest.org, which is basically a nonprofit that they aggregate all of the test optional announcements. They update it daily. And truly, some of these announcements, once we get into the summer months heavy, the announcements sometimes come pretty frequently over the summer because colleges need to make those decisions before the applications open for the next cycle. So in the next month or two, we may hear of some other schools, but I feel like a lot of them already made the decision. A lot of them were pressured to make a decision early in the year, early in the calendar year, so that students could start to plan their testing, you know, whether or not they had to find a test center or not. So anyway, I just wanted to make that point about the fact that if you are testing and you're testing well, that it is going to help you. You know, it is going to be something. The other thing that you can do is if you're looking at a school and you're wondering, does it benefit me to apply test optional or should I submit test scores? You can always look at their middle 50% range for test scores and see, am I following in that? That information is typically accessible through, you can look at their websites, of course, you can look at their common data set. If you Google the name of a school, you can find information under their common data set information. There's all kinds of resources to find that number, or you can even just email them or call them and say, hey, I'd like to know about this. They don't, you know, they're not going to write your name down. You know, Joe Smith called and asked about test optional. So that gives us cause for concern that something's wrong with his testing, you know. Schools don't have the time to think through that stuff. And I mentioned earlier about suppression of scores. One of the things I will let you know is that the colleges, many of them use a tool, a review tool called Slate. And within this tool that they use, they're able to suppress information that they don't want to see. So if they are a test blind institution, they can actually make that field invisible, meaning when their admission officers are reviewing an application, it doesn't come up on the screen. They also have the ability to do that if a student checks, I'm applying test optional, I don't want my scores to be used, then they can suppress that information in the review. Their college admission officers are not working to try to deny students. That's, you know, that's another big myth. And I worked in college admissions, so I can say this as a fact. They're looking for reasons to admit a student, and so they're not going to try to, you know, overthink why one test date wasn't there, or, you know, they're not doing that. They want to see your very best. Again, coming into the audition with your very best. Show us your very best, and that's what we're going to judge you on. And so those are all my soapbox pieces that I wanted to say from an admission standpoint, because I know that that's on the minds of a lot of families, is like, what do we do with this? You can also specifically choose which schools to send scores to or not. It's not a blanket decision. You may have some schools where you are in that middle 50% or higher. You say, yes, I think it makes sense for me to send my scores because this is a positive data point for that school. Whereas others, if you're not in that middle 50% or not even close, you may decide, these ones I'm not going to. You will answer that question individually for each college that you're applying to on your application. You'll actually check that box. So that's just something important to know. It's not a blanket decision that you make for all the colleges. And it may take some time to think through and research what you want to do for each of those. So anything to add on any of that stuff, Josephine, that any of those things I just mentioned? It was kind of like a rambling of my mind, but you know me well enough to know that's normal.
Yeah, I mean, my mind works the same way. We actually did a webinar not too long ago with Bob Schaefer from Fair Test. So I'm just gonna pop the link to that in the chat in case anyone wants to hear more from Fair Test. So it was just really nice to hear, from Bob Schaefer himself. So I think test optional is just such a wonderful opportunity. I've always been very in love with the concept and wanted more universities to do it. And you talked about silver linings in the beginning, and I think the fact that test optional has become something that a lot of universities not only switched to for last year and this year, but are really considering these 2 years as a test run to see if they want to keep that as they're always their new normal, I think is so wonderful. I think the point you made that you can strengthen your application if you want to is really great. So basically, test optional allows these tests to be additive only. They used to really take away from an application. If your GPA is really high and your test score is really low, it's like, oh, what happened there? Red flag. And so now, if you struggle with tests, if you have a learning difference, if you have focus, attention, processing issues, and you study hard for these tests and you just can't move them, but your GPA is something to be proud of, you work hard, you love what you do, you love learning, you're excited for college, you can just wash your hands of this and you can just not take them. Now, I'm saying this for the class of 2022. It's still not all universities, right? So really check, just make sure that all of the schools on your list are either test optional or test free before you make the decision to not test. But if they are, just relax and focus on something else. Do something cool in your extracurriculars. Challenge yourself a little bit more in your academics, whatever it is. Focus on other aspects of your application. Hone in on those essays, right? But don't run, hit your head against a wall over and over again if this is not your thing. However, if you have, a big red flag somewhere. So maybe virtual learning was a huge struggle for you. And so your grades took a big dip in junior year. And you really want to show the university, man, like, I know this is my cumulative GPA right now, but I just really don't identify with that. I know I can do more. And you happen to be okay at standardized testing and you have the motivation to put in the time to study, then this test is a great opportunity for you to show them, hey, I know this is a little bit of a red flag, but here's what I can do. And then, on top of that, in your additional information essay, you can describe in your application, you can provide that context that the virtual learning environment maybe just didn't work that well for you, or maybe you were having a different struggle in math or something like that. And that, you're choosing, you really hope that your standardized test score can show them what you're actually capable of, because that's more how you identify. So, in the past, we've had students whose GPA was really reflective of what they can do and their test score really wasn't, but they still had to submit it. So it really took away from their application, while this test optional movement from so many universities really makes the standardized tests additive. So if you feel like the test will strengthen your application, submit it. If you feel like it will detract from your application, don't submit it. That may be different at different universities, right? Yeah. So at universities that you're feeling are more likely your target, and your score is in that upper 50%, and your GPA is looking good too, you're probably going to want to submit it. Versus at universities where your GPA is in the upper 50%, but your test score is in the lower 50%, maybe you don't submit it, because as a total applicant, right, they'll factor it in if you submit it, but not if you don't. So think about what makes you look better with all the moving parts of your application. There are a lot of different parts, right? Christina was talking about the holistic review. What will really make you as a whole show them what kind of student you are. And I know that these these tests say they measure college readiness, but, I think you can get some college readiness skills and learn some college readiness skills by preparing for the tests. But do they measure it? No, they measure how well you test in a standardized test setting on a Saturday morning when you're forced to sit down for 4 hours, right? Or 3 hours. So most universities do understand, because a lot of research has shown that GPA is a much more effective predictor of actual college success. So your GPA is always going to be weighted more heavily. But like I said, if you have a red flag in your academic record, these tests are a really great opportunity to still show, hey, I am strong in math and I do want to go into the STEM field, even though, I had this faux pas happen over here and here's my reasoning. So it's really an individual choice, and it's really a great opportunity in either way. So it kind of takes the stress off, because you can find what is my strongest application. Quick anecdote. I know we're running out of time, but I had a student. I'm so proud of her. She has a wonderful GPA, has worked really hard, and really, really struggled with the standardized test. I think she got either a 15 or a 17 on the ACT after studying for months, and on practice tests, way better, mid-20s, right? But just the anxiety on test day and just everything coming together just really held her back from showing her skill set. When they dropped that requirement, she got into a school we categorized as a wild card. She got in. It was her school that she thought she would never be able to go to, but she just wanted to send an application there because now her GPA was the only indicator for academic prowess instead of that test score detracting from it. So that was huge. That was so wonderful. But I have had other students who applied test optional and who had a really great test score and felt so much better being able to submit that at the school that allowed them to because they balanced something out. So both ways, it really works to the student's best advantage, I think.
Well, this has been really good information. And I think if not anything else, I think people can walk away with some myths busted, which hopefully leads to some lessened anxiety in this whole process of testing. And for those watching, Josephine mentioned that they offer a diagnostic at Strive to Learn. And so we'll share that information as well in terms of how to get to that. And thank you. There you go. She put it into the chat. But if anyone has questions after today, feel free to reach out to us at Estrella. We can also pass questions on to Josephine. You can find her at Strive to Learn. And thanks for joining us tonight. Thank you, Josephine. This was really great, and enjoy the rest of your night. Thanks, everybody.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Bye.